Hello everyone, welcome to Learn ReactJS for Frontend Development by CodeChef. Forms are a key part of any interactive website. It allows users to enter and submit information. In React, form inputs are handled using state. That way, whatever is typed in by the user is in sync with what is displayed on the screen. So in this lesson, we'll be looking at how data moves through forms in React. So let's begin. Forms are how users interact with an application. Whenever users type, submit, or select something, they're using a form. In React, forms are handled using state instead of relying directly on the browser. This gives us better control, predictable behavior, and the ability to build responsive interfaces. So what is data binding? Data binding means connecting an input field with React state. When the user types something, the state updates. When the state updates, the UI automatically reflects the new value. This creates a smooth two-way connection between user input and the screen. When an input gets its value from the React state, it is called a control component. This means React fully controls what appears inside the input field. Instead of the browser managing input values, React becomes a single source of truth. There are a few important rules to follow when working with controlled inputs. Always pair the value attribute with an onChange handler. Inputs should never start with undefined values, and updates should always happen through state and not by directly modifying the input. A common warning you may see is when an input switches from uncontrolled to controlled. This usually happens when state is not initialized properly. For text inputs, always start with an empty string. This avoids unexpected behavior and warning messages. Controlled inputs are managed completely by React state. Uncontrolled inputs rely on the browser's DOM. While uncontrolled inputs may seem simpler at first, controlled inputs allow real-time validation, better consistency, and easier debugging. A common mistake is handling form submission using only button-click events. This ignores important behavior like submitting a form by pressing enter. In React, forms should use the onSubmit event on the form element. This ensures all expected submission behavior works correctly. By default, submitting a form causes the page to reload. In modern React applications, we want to handle submissions without refreshing the page. Event.preventDefault stops this default behavior and allows React to manage the data instead. Select dropdowns in React are also controlled using state. The selected values come from state and the changes are handled using onChange. There is no need to use the selected attribute on options when working with React. Radio buttons work as a group and share the same name attribute. Each radio button is controlled using checked property. React state decides which option is correctly selected. Checkboxes are controlled using the checked attribute instead of value. They usually store boolean values like true or false. This makes them ideal for toggles, preferences, and subscription options. When applications grow, we often deal with more than simple values. Complex state includes objects and arrays and store related data together. Forms with multiple fields are a common example of complex state. React state should never be modified directly. When updating objects, always create a new copy using the spread operator. For nested objects, each level must also be copied to maintain immutability. Arrays must also be updated immutably. Methods like map, filter, and spread syntax help create new arrays. This ensures React correctly detects changes and re-renders the UI. In this example, we are building a simple React component that demonstrates how form inputs work using state. The goal is to keep the input field and the displayed text perfectly in sync, and also allow a button to update both of them at once. This will help us understand how control components behave in React. Let us start at the top. We import the useState hook from React. This hook allows us to store and update values inside our component, which is essential for handling form inputs. Inside the component, we create a state variable called value along with its updater function setValue. We initialize it with an empty string. This state will hold whatever the text the user types, and it will also be used to display that text on the screen. Next, we define a function called generateRandomString. Inside this function, we create a random string using JavaScript's math.random method. Once the random string is generated, we call setValue with this new value. This single state update will automatically update both the input field and the displayed text. Now let us look at the input field. The value attribute of the input is set to our state variable. This makes the input a control component, meaning React decides what value appears inside. Whenever the user types, the onChange event fires. Inside that event, we update the state using setValue, passing in the current input value. This is how typing instantly updates both the input and the UI. Below the input, we display the current value using a paragraph tag. Since this text is directly connected to state, it updates in real time as the user types or when the state changes in any other way. This clearly shows how state drives the UI in React. Finally, we have a button labeled generate random string, and when the button is clicked, it triggers a generate random string function. Because this function updates the same state variable, both the input field and the displayed text update immediately with the new random value. So let's just run this code once. So let's say I type out CodeChef over here. So you can see the word CodeChef is being displayed out as soon as we type it into the form. So let's say I give generate random string. So you can see our string is being generated. Let's just submit this code once. So we have passed all 3 test cases. So in React, all form controls follow the same basic idea. Instead of letting the browser manage input values, React keeps those values inside state. There are 2 key concepts that make this work. First is value binding. For most inputs, we use the value attribute. For checkboxes and radio buttons, we use checked. Second is change handling. Whenever the user interacts with an input, we use an onChange to capture that change and update the state. Once the state updates, React automatically updates the UI. In plain HTML, the selected option is controlled using the selected attribute on an option. But in React, we don't do that. Instead, the selected value is controlled by the state, and the select element reads its value directly from that state. Now in this example, we start by creating a state variable called fruit. It stores the currently selected option. We initialize it with banana, so banana is selected by default. The value attribute of select is bound to our state variable. This makes the dropdown a control component. Whenever the user selects a different option, the onChange event fires. We then update the state using setFruit with the new selected value. Now in these 2 lines over here, note that we don't use the selected attribute here. React decides which option is selected based entirely on the state value. Finally, we display the selected fruit. Since this text depends on state, it updates instantly whenever the selection changes. In React, the select element is controlled using the value attribute. State decides which option is selected and not the HTML markup. Radio buttons work as a group and share the same name attribute. Each radio button is controlled using the checked attribute. React compares the current state value with each radio's value to decide which one should be selected. Whenever a radio button is changed, the onChange handler updates state and React updates the UI. Checkboxes are slightly different because they represent true or false values. Instead of value, we use the checked attribute. To update state, we read e.target.checked, which gives us a boolean. This makes checkboxes ideal for toggles, preferences, and subscriptions. Let's just run this code once. So here we have our drop down from which we can select apple or banana, and it is reflected on our screen. Let's just submit this code once. So we have passed the test case. Now to really understand how this works, try writing each example inside your app component. Change the initial state values, add more options, and observe how React updates the UI. Now in this example here, we are working with complex state in React. Instead of a single value, our state contains an object with multiple related fields, including a nested object. The goal here is to practice updating different parts of state without mutating it, which is a critical concept in React. Now first we start by creating a user state object. Now this object stores the user's name, age, and an address object. Because all of this data is related, it makes sense to group it into a single state object rather than multiple separate states. Notice that address itself is a nested object. This is what makes the state complex. Next, we create separate state variables for each input field. These track what the user is typing before we update the main user state. This separation allows us to validate input and control when updates actually happen. Now let us start with updating the name. First, we check if the input is not empty. If it contains the value, we update the user state. We use the spread operator to copy the previous user object and then override only the name field. This ensures immutability. We never modify the original object directly. After updating, we clear the input field. Updating the age requires an extra step. Since input values are strings by default, we first convert the input into a number. We then Check if the result is a valid number using isNaN. Only if the value is valid do we update the state. This prevents invalid data from entering our application. Again, we use the spread operator and clear the input afterward. Now this function over here is the most important part of our example. Here, we are updating a nested object inside state. To do this correctly, we must copy both the outer object and the nested object. First, we copy the existing user object. Then, we copy the existing address object and update only the city field. This layered copying ensures React detects the change and re-renders correctly. Now finally, we are going to be displaying the state, that is the user profile information is rendered directly from state. Whenever any part of the state updates, React automatically updates the UI. This shows the benefit of immutable updates. The UI always stays in sync. Each input field is a control component. The input's values come from state and changes are handled using onChange. This gives React full control over input behavior and allows us to validate and reset fields easily. Now there are three important lessons from this example. First, always treat state as immutable. Second, when updating objects, copy only what you need to change. Third, when dealing with nested state, every level must be copied. So let us just run this code once. So let me give name as Bob and see if it gets updated. So you can see name has been updated. Let me update the age from 25 to 20. And I updated the age also. And let me give city as Chennai. So you can see we can update name, age and address. Let's just submit this code once. So you can see we have passed all three test cases. So that wraps up our introduction to forms in React. To really understand this concept, make sure to head over to the CodeChef platform and try out the practice problems yourself. That's where the real learning happens. That was it for this lesson and I will see you in the next one. Thank you.